Hello and welcome to the first installment of my development log series. In this episode I'll be introducing my new project, Colonise, which is going to be a turn-based strategy game where the player expands their empire across a galaxy. It's worth pointing out I'm used to working directly on console SDKs, but I want to try out something new, so this series will all be done within Unity. First of all, I needed some models to work with. This is my first time using Blender, or any modelling software for that matter, but I managed to find some great low poly tutorials online and was able to make a home planet that I'm happy with, at least for now. I'm deciding to stick with a low poly theme throughout the entire game because I'm not a designer or a modeler, and quite frankly my art skills are horrendous. But as you can see, all the textures were pretty easy to set up, and it's quite simple to select a group of polygons and edit the colour, as I'm about to show you with this snow-peaked mountain here. So here I'm just selecting the pixel and then hitting Ctrl+ to expand the group, and then you just assign the new texture, and there you go, it's red instead of white. The planet itself is by no means perfect, but for my first ever attempt I'm quite pleased with the results. Colonise is going to use a turn-based hexagonal grid system, so I needed a hexagon to work with as well that I can place into a grid to form the map where the player will move around and explore new areas and planets. So here I just made a very simple outline with an alpha component in the middle so that I can make it see-through but still selectable. That way the user will be able to hover and click on the tile but also see the skybox underneath once it's in the game. Moving on to some programming now, the first task was to create the grid manager script, which takes in a game object hex, which we drag and drop into the field in the Unity editor to tell it what a hex is, as in one tile. It also takes in a width and height, which I'm going to keep as an odd number so that the player can always be centered in their starting position. We then figure out the sizes of each hex based on the mesh, so that we know how far to space them apart, and a simple for loop with some mathematical equations places them all in the correct place. Finally, just for the middle value, like I said, I wanted that to be where the player starts, so that is where we add a planet. So now, moving on to the script for the hex tile itself, we've just got the function to add a planet, and that puts it just slightly above in the Y position so that it would be floating above the hex, instantiates it, and sets the variable has planet to true because there can only ever be one planet in a hex. Back in Unity I made a prefab called game controller. You can see here it's just got a grid manager script with the width and the height set, and the hex was dragged and dropped in, which is another prefab I just created. This game controller was added later and we'll get to that. So now for the planet code itself. At the moment this is very simple and basic. There will be a lot of stats and variables and slots for different buildings and so forth as we go along in development, but right now it's just a simple function that lets the planet float up and down and rotate slightly. You may have also noticed this selectable component here, which is another script I developed, and it's attached to both the planet and the hex. And this script is so we can figure out what's being hovered over or what's being clicked on. At the top it takes in that game controller prefab which we set up and tagged earlier, and it fires that up in initialization along with a colour just to add a highlight to the object that we're hovering over. It's then got the get and set name that we saw a minute ago with planet and hex, and they can be individual per planet, but for now I've just set it to planet for simplicity. We then check if the mouse is either over the object or not, and if it is, add the colour on. And when it's clicked, we set its tag as selected, clearing any other selected objects from that tag. So moving into the editor now, you can see that the 5x5 grid has been created, and we've got that planet floating nicely in the middle, and when I hover over each tile it highlights, and so does the planet. I also added some camera functionality, zooming in and out here, which is clamped, and then translating. I do need to add clamps to the translation because at the moment you could go as far off screen as you wanted, but we'll get that done eventually. You probably also noticed the background being a skybox. I got 6 images off the asset store. Unfortunately, the material file that they came with was not working, so I had to make my own. But it's very simple. Once you have that material file, you just set it up through those lighting options there. And in order to set up the material file, you just select the special skybox 6-sided and then apply each texture to a face. After making a couple of panels to track the UI within the Unity editor, I moved on to coding the game controller itself. So as you can see here, we've got somewhere to store the GUI, the heads-up display, and also an object Go to keep track of the currently selected item. We've got this clear selected here earlier, which will make sure that there's only one item selected at once, because we never want multiple. And also set selected, so we can read in when it changes without having to keep reading the object every time something needs to happen. We then update the UI, so turn it on for a start when something's selected and off when it isn't. And at the minute, I'm just very simply outputting the name into a text field, but here we'll have lots of options later on and stats, I'm sure. We've also got the escape key to clear selected, so that's a way of exiting from your current selection if you wish to not have anything. And if we can see this in action now, you can see when I click on the planet, the name comes up there, and when I click on a hex, it changes. Now all the hexes do have the same name despite me clicking on them at the minute. We can switch between the planet and the hex, but that's just because it's a string being stored. That will be changed eventually, maybe not for the hexes. I don't actually know if they're going to be selected yet, but the planet at least will have its own unique name, and it's probably going to be something that the player can choose as well, to be fair. I think that's all for this week anyway, but thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and come back next time where we'll possibly be looking at getting some ships into the game. Either that or just fleshing out the stats on this planet and what it can do.